In past wars, anti-war music rarely got airtime or recognition. This recognition would go to pro-war music, positive and patriotic. Even Civil War tunes, which were popularly sung by soldiers themselves, were positive toward the war. But the 1960s created a completely different atmosphere, with music being versatile and quick to adapt to modern conflicts. Even the soldiers in Vietnam sang these anti-war tunes. For some of them were so dark and ironic, it was their only way to cope with the trauma of combat. These very blunt anti-war songs started appearing in 1964 with Lyndon B. Johnson's election. He promised, quote, not to send American boys to fight a war Asian boys ought to be fighting, end quote. And then, in 1965, he sent 200,000 American troops to Vietnam. This sparked a lot of anger and directly inspired Tom Paxton's Lyndon Johnson Told a Nation, which critiqued Johnson's hypocrisy. The chorus chants, and Lyndon Johnson told the nation, have no fear of escalation. I am trying everyone to please. Though it isn't really war, we're sending 50,000 more to help save Vietnam from the Vietnamese. The song continues to tell gruesome depictions of combat, and the anger Paxton felt from Johnson's broken promises made his song reek of irony and sarcasm. A similar musical reaction to this came from Barry Maguire with his song Eve of Destruction. The song, with its use of steady drums, guitar, and harmonica, encompasses both the folk and rock sounds of the 1960s. Similar to Lyndon Johnson Told a Nation, Eve of Destruction is a very bitter and critical song. Maguire introduces the song with these lyrics. You're old enough to kill, but not for votin'. You don't believe in war, but what's that gun you're totin'? And even the Jordan River has bodies floatin'. But you tell me over and over and over again, my friend, you don't believe we're on the eve of destruction. These harsh and blunt lyrics directly call out the hypocrisy of sending young men out to war who can't even vote. The listener here should get the idea that Maguire completely disagrees with the Vietnam cause and is angered by the injustices surrounding fighting a war Americans don't want to fight, and around sending young men into war who may be losing their entire lives. In 1965, the first major anti-war protests broke out led by groups such as the Students for a Democratic Society. Phil Oakes, a very popular folk singer at the time, was a notable performer at these protests, with his songs I Ain't Marching Anymore, White Boots Marching in a Yellow Land, and We Seek No Wider War, which was actually a quote that Lyndon B. Johnson said himself regarding the Vietnam War. All three of these songs directly criticized the war and were actually censored on the radio due to their content. They were very out front and violent and gory. Today, it may seem that these anti-war songs were super popular, but it's important to keep in mind that none of Phil Oakes' songs ever made it into the top 100. In fact, the war inspired musicians to write songs in favor of the war as well as against, which producers tried to push to get more airtime. We won't dive into these particular songs, but it's important to recognize that alongside anti-war music, the war was also able to spark patriotic feelings into pro-war music. These songs stuck most closely with the genre of country and western, which have always exhibited more conservative ideals. These songs include Barry Sadler's Ballad of the Green Beret, Dave Dudley's Hello Vietnam, and Merle Haggard's Okie from Muskogee. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, Vietnam soldiers had a love for songs written with dark humor and gore. These songs were ultimately inspired by the violence toward both soldiers and innocent civilians in the Vietnam War. The war was far different from wars in the past because it was the first war to ever be televised. Therefore, the average American could turn on the news and be exposed to the horrors of combat. Ultimately, these horrors inspired I Feel Like I'm Fixin' to Die Rag by Country Joe McDonald, which used dark humor to criticize the violence. Here are some lyrics. Come on, mothers throughout the land, pack your boys off to Vietnam. Come on, fathers, and don't hesitate to send your sons off before it's too late. And you can be the first ones in your block to have your boy come home in a box. We Gotta Get Out of This Place by Eric Burdon and the Animals, similar in style to I Feel Like I'm Fixin' to Die Rag, was recognized widely by Vietnam soldiers as their anthem. The song tells a story of going home, which was clearly inspired by the brutality of the war and the fact that soldiers left their entire lives to fight for it. Both of these songs used the horrors of the war and the violence of the war to make a point using irony, humor, and sarcasm. In 1968, the longevity of the Tet Offensive which was a series of brutal attacks on South Vietnam from North Vietnam, banished all hope in America that their soldiers could be victorious. We were no closer to victory than we were in 1965, and at the beginning of 1968, there were 486,000 American troops in Vietnam, and by the end of the year, death toll in combat had exceeded 30,000. By the end of 1968, also, half of Americans personally knew a casualty. People were angry and hopeless and desperate. Songs emerged such as The Doors' Unknown Soldier and The Byrds' Draft Morning and Wasn't Born to Follow. All these songs were directly critical of the war and encompassed the rock sound that the youth liked. Draft Morning directly called out the injustice of the draft with the lyrics, "Today was the day for action, leave my bed to kill instead, why should it happen?" In 1969, Richard Nixon implemented Vietnamization, which was the process to replace U.S. troops with Southern Vietnamese troops. At this point, people were generally happy. The protests they made that centered around leaving the war were finally being listened to, and there was less of a need for anti-war songs at this point, which made for music to become more analytical and reflective on how Vietnam was handled. Creedence Clearwater Revival's Fortunate Son critiqued the privilege wealthy and educated individuals got regarding the selective service. Lyrics saying, "I ain't the senator's son," and "I ain't the millionaire's son," called out the privilege the wealthy had in dodging the draft. Crosby, Still, and Nash's Find the Cost of Freedom used imagery to depict the dead soldiers finally at rest. The entirety of the song's lyrics are as follows. "Find the cost of freedom, buried in the ground. Mother Earth will swallow you. Lay your body down." The gentle guitar and chorus of voices singing this song is one to give anybody chills. It resembles the end of a conflict and the final chance for those who have lost loved ones to finally be at peace. Marvin Gaye's What's Going On in 1970 was another reflective song on the war that actually won a Grammy and was Billboard's second most popular song of the year. So at this point, it is clear that the Vietnam War popularized anti-war music in the media. Lastly, past 1970, with less and less troops in Vietnam, music started to put war in the past and attempt to move on. Canned Heat's Going Up the Country suggested closure as living a simpler life and avoiding tensions of the city. That is the last song that we will be talking about. Give the songs linked below on the website a listen. They are very good. I really suggest them. I enjoyed listening to them, and I think you will too.